We're really thrilled to welcome the Odin Quartet for today. This is a workshop that Joseph and I have been thinking about doing pretty much since we started Rivers, and so we're really excited to hear what they have to say about how composers can maximize what they get out of rehearsals, how they can approach working with musicians, what the etiquette is. Everything will cover from notation to rehearsal techniques to basically, these folks have a ton of experience working with young composers, working with experienced composers, and as I was talking to Sam earlier, oftentimes the feedback in this relationship goes one way. The composer gives a score and tells a bunch of stuff to the musicians, but because we don't get enough rehearsal time or there's only one performance, the performers often don't get to give their feedback back to the composers about what could have been done better, what could have been done more efficiently. So hopefully this is sort of a chance for them to unload all of the information that has accumulated and the opinions that have accumulated for them over the years. But before we start, as we gather here today, we want to acknowledge that the CMC is in Takaranto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Takaranto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. It is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands, and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We thank the Indigenous people who share this land with us and allow us to be here as uninvited guests. The Canadian Music Centre was founded in 1959. We were established in the context of violent state policies targeting Indigenous communities, including the Potlatch Ban, the 60s Scoop, and residential schools. These policies were not part of some dark chapter ended in the past, as injustice and violence against Indigenous people are ongoing. Acknowledging the land is to acknowledge that the CMC and many legacy arts organizations within Canada have been a part of racist policies that devalue and seek to erase Indigenous cultural expression. So, also just before we start, a little bit about the Odin Quartet. Passionate about chamber music, the Toronto-based Odin Quartet represents the diversity and the promise of youth in Canada. Named after the one-eyed Norse god, seeker of knowledge and holder of the wisdom of the world, the Odin Quartet explores the role of classical music in modern-day storytelling. Since 2015, the ensemble is also dedicated to making classical music accessible to new generations of listeners by promoting modern Canadian compositions, including those of cellist Samuel Besson, alongside classical music literature. In June 2015, the Odin Quartet took part in the Luminato Festival's epic production of R. Murray Schafer's 1980 oratorio Apocalypsis. Since their 2017 debut at the opening gala of the Music Niagara Festival, the quartet has been a recurring performer at the Summer Festival in 2019 and 2021. Other festival appearances include the University of Toronto's New Music Festival, Midday Music with Shiguru, the Ottawa Valley New Music Festival, Guelph Connections, and Music Mondays Toronto. The Odin Quartet has enjoyed multiple collaborations with the Scarborough Philharmonic Orchestra as its ensemble in residence since 2018. Most recently, the quartet premiered a new piece for string quartet and symphony orchestra by Samuel Besson, alongside under the baton of Maestro Ron Breuer. And just to introduce the folks in front of us, we have on cello, Samuel Besson, on viola, Matt Antal, on violin, one or two, or does it matter?
It changes.
Tanya Charles Iveniak, and also on violin, Alex Toskov. So I'm going to go out of the way here, and we will start our discussion. And I will mute this thing that's been making lots of noise. Okay, so as I said, this is going to be about sort of maximizing for composers who don't maybe have a ton of time going into a rehearsal, don't have a ton of time going into a workshop or a reading session. What can they do to sort of maximize the end result? I know that sounds a bit corporate and a bit sort of cold, but at the end of the day, when composers, especially younger composers and emerging composers, are getting these opportunities, it's a very limited opportunity, and they need to kind of walk away with something that's usable, that's maybe recorded, that they can use for a grant. And so, I know we have a list of things we want to cover, but if there's sort of one most important thing that a composer can do to prepare for a rehearsal or a reading session with you guys, let's say they have 1 hour of time, that 1 hour is maximized.
I think that let's get out of the way the obvious stuff, which is, I think you need to know what the instruments are, the limitations in terms of, how they work and the extremities of pitches or whatever. Like, let's assume that the composer already knows all of
Yeah.
that. Because obviously that's step number one. But I think that would be if anybody writing the string quartet would probably familiarize themselves with the instruments and those possibilities. So I think for me, it really comes down to having clear communication. We certainly we see a lot of things all the time that is maybe imperfect, but if there's enough communication, it's clear enough what they're going for, we can deal with it, and we can usually figure it out and all that stuff. So notation is really probably the key in general. You and I talked a little bit ahead about how I was saying myself as a composer, I did try to deliver music as though I don't exist, as in nobody can ask questions, and therefore you need to have everything on the page. Now I think we all do that as composers, but that's definitely the goal. And so yeah, it comes down to notation. I don't know if anybody wants to bring in other subjects ahead of delving in.
I think sometimes even just having a short list of maybe things that you wanted to write or wanted to try, but are unable to maybe either find the right sound for it or that sort of thing. Like if you have questions about particular parts of a piece and you're like, maybe we can try this sonority, what would it sound like with mute, like those sort of things. Like if there's like a short list of maybe types of sounds that you wanted to create but maybe aren't sure how, even being able to articulate that and ask the performers what they might suggest might be helpful, just going in at the gate. I'm sure those things can also develop as the reading goes through, but sometimes those are nice to have because the interesting thing is that we might have come across some of these spots ourselves too, and been like, what are you trying to achieve here? And so if you're questioning it, then there's a possibility that we might have also had the same question or something similar.
Along those lines, I mean, I think that obviously a first step, and this is definitely true if you're writing for instruments you don't know, consulting someone is obviously a really great thing to do, but that's a pretty privileged thing to have musicians that that are available to you and can answer a phone call or whatever, meet with you to try these things out. So short of that, yeah, I completely agree. And again, sometimes it's just about writing instructions. If you're putting a tremolo in a part, it can sound frantic or it can sound kind of shimmery, right? So just putting a word in there to help us guide what kind of trem you're trying to get can help. So it can feel overdone a little bit sometimes, but certainly that if you want to use a descriptor, it's going to help us get what you want.
So this is an interesting one, and I think this one comes up in composer discussions a lot. In fact, I recently saw a Facebook discussion sort of along these lines of how valuable are descriptors, like adjectival and like subjective descriptors versus musical terms in notation. And then you guys sort of related to that is what you were saying, when you deliver a score, delivering it in such a way that the composer doesn't have to be there, right, in order for so having all that information on the page. But that sort of comes to this natural question of how much is too much, because obviously if you're sight reading or if you're working quickly, you're trying to compute all this information on the page, and all of a sudden you're adding more and more information in the page. So I guess there's two questions here: is how and this sort of gets to something else we were talking about earlier. How much is too much versus too little? And what's better? Descriptors that are sort of more subjective and like using English adjectives, or trying to get into using the more specific terminology of, say, string techniques?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that if we can just go like historically, you've got a certain amount of things that are written in the part. This is just true in music in general. And you've got a movement, the obvious one that comes to mind is Ravel. There's the whole movement about, or Mahler, about writing things in your own language as opposed to the Italian. But then they go and they're certainly in those composers, in those two composers, well, they'll write like sede instead of writ. And then some people, there's discussions on what all these terms mean, especially if it's in Icelandic or something, right? Like you'd have to kind of like just figure out that those very basic terms. those would be probably more of a hindrance than anything else. So I would say you start with what exists in the repertoire already of musical terms. Don't reinvent the wheel. If it's allegro, just write allegro, it's fine. Or rallentando, you can write rall. But at the same time, if it gets more complex than that, and let's assume for the context of what I'm about to say that this is English speakers who are writing, a descriptor written, if you write a description, put it in Google Translate so that it's written in Italian to make it look more credible. Like, we're just going to do the reverse, and that's really not that useful. We have those experiences.
I was about to say, has that happened to you?
Yes, of course. And so I think that, so use the regular repertoire, whatever's, that one-page list of things that you've got that are all in Italian or whatever. Use those. And if those fail you, then move on to descriptors, as in English or in whatever language the composer is writing in. Or speaks or lives in, rather. When it comes to too much versus too little, it really depends. These days I would say if I see allegro written, it's not very much info. It depends if the title of the piece is very clear of what you want, If it's like an icy morning, then you're like, okay, I get an idea of what we're going for. But if it's just called allegro and then the tempo is allegro and then you start playing, we're like, it's allegro. let's go. I don't know if
I also I am very much interested and appreciate getting into the composer's brain before I get into the piece itself. So if there is something like a story or some sort of setting that would be great for us to know in order to be able to dissect what it is that you've written, that's actually really helpful, because I want to know what kind of journey I'm about to go on. And then, everything that Sam was saying once we get into the piece totally still applies, but at least I'm approaching it from the perspective of, this is the mood I'm trying to create, and then maybe when there's a tonal shift, I go, oh, this is the other part of the story that they're talking about. Like, it's a very clear journey in my mind. So I appreciate knowing why you've written something or what it is that you're trying to depict.
And even if you were not to really know why you wrote something, then maybe you can give us more direction in the score itself with the different expressions or things that you want us to accomplish. But as Tanya says, that's actually a really, really good point, that sometimes we'll get the first page, sometimes we'll get more than one page, where the composer really goes deep into, I was really troubled at that time, or I was really excited at that time, or this was the best period of my life, this was the worst period of my life, and I was really inspired to write this music. And then if they write Andante, we'll know what kind of approach we have. So that's actually a really, really good point. And sometimes we ask composers and they straight up tell us that they have no idea, that the inspiration just came on its own and they just wanted to write something. So they didn't have any kind of backstory to it necessarily. If anything, speaking of too much or too little, I think that what can be really confusing is if you get some sort of andante sostenuto con dolore in the first bar, and then 5 bars after you get con dolcezza or something suddenly, that can be a little bit confusing. So if you're changing the mood every 4 or 5 bars, then that can be a little bit, wait, you just set up the mood for one thing and then suddenly you're changing. If that's your style, that's also fine. But it's good to get one general idea of what you're going with. And even if you write Allegro con spirito at the beginning, then we'll approach it as, okay, fast-ish, but with this kind of a little bit extra excitement to it.
I think the other, as sort of like a lasting maybe thought, is if you can sort of step outside of yourself and imagine that you were not the person who wrote this piece, would there be enough information for whoever needs to dissect it to be able to give back what you had in your mind in the first place? So if it's a tall order to sort of step outside yourself and see, does this would this be enough information for me to get what I want? But I think it's probably a good practice. Yeah.
And on the topic of the too little too much topic in terms of like writing a backstory or whatever at the beginning. My advice would be to approach that as kind of writing an article, in the sense of like when you're writing an article for a paper that most people will read the first paragraph, but not everyone will read the rest of the story. So kind of have like this kind of like brief version at the top, and then like you can delve in deeper. Because certainly when we're, let's say you plop something in front of us, we'll want to get information quickly, but we don't want to waste 10 minutes of the rehearsal reading the whole novel, right? So yeah, we should all kind of do our own reading on it, but like sometimes we'll read it out loud, like just like the first couple sentences. If you can get like your message across, at least the whole kind of like general idea of the piece or whatever, in the Coles Notes version at the top, and then you kind of dig in deeper. And I would say the same is true when you talk about, if again in terms of notation, if you're doing a lot of extended techniques, or if you're doing strange notation, a legend is really, really useful. But again, sometimes you want to make sure that it's something concise. I mean, when it's a legend, you want something to refer to, right? So you don't need a paragraph to describe what spiccato means. You just kind of go back with what the X notation means, the X head or whatever.
Right.
Or the triangle or whatever you wrote. You just that hit body of instrument, cool, got it, and then then you've got that to refer to. But it doesn't hurt to put like a little footnote on the first time it happens to the page too as well.
Oh, interesting.
But that's not necessary. It really depends on where you go to. But certainly flipping back is not fun. So
right.
Thing to keep in mind.
That's an interesting thing about the program note, because I think for many composers that's sometimes a bit of a last minute throwaway of, oh my God, the concert organizer needs a program note. And it's done and off, but the fact that it can now also be an effective tool for sort of helping the performers along and sort of making things more efficient and clear, I think that's a really important takeaway.
I've heard. Sorry to jump. Because
jump.
The number of times, it's mostly with orchestra stuff, and so presumably maybe hopefully the conductor already had that kind of vision. But I feel like so often we rehearse orchestra stuff, and then we get out to play the show. The composer or the conductor comes out to talk about the piece, and they talk about it, and you're like, that's what it's about. and it's like, well, that would have been useful to know when we were rehearsing this thing. So yeah, you don't want surprises, like especially if it's a quartet. Like that's really weird and embarrassing if the composer comes out and tells a story, and you're like, oh man, this is very dark. This is not at all I was playing. and then the conflict, like you've got our eyes kind of being like, are we playing it like have we been playing it, or are we trying to like chill it, or and it's so like give us some info. It definitely helps.
That's good to know. Safe to file. So you mentioned spiccato, the deadly word. Well, not the deadly word, but a word that we've talked about before. One of the when you kind of do orchestration 101 in composer school, you kind of go through, at least in like the famous Adler textbook, you go through like multiple pages of all these very detailed, very like classical string techniques, and you're taught all the different ways of notating them and marking them and everything. We were talking beforehand, and I've spoken about this with other string players, that often it is composers are being unhelpful sometimes when trying to get into the specificities of these things, versus what you're saying is write what you want and then leave the technical side of things up to the professionals. I'm just gonna put that one out there, and I'm gonna let you guys talk about that, because I think this is more specifically about strings, but I think this is an interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, I like how you framed that, but what I was saying to you before is with something like spiccato, you'll typically see that in a score, and one of two things will come up. Either you see it and you go, well, obviously, because it's going a certain tempo and it's the natural thing to do, or you go, yeah, that's not going to happen, that's not going to work, and we fake something else that's not spiccato. So again, as you said, like if you give the mood or the kind of the intention a little bit more than the trying to specifically point to our technique, I think it's better. Certainly for me, bowings and parts is something I as in printed bowings from the composer is usually typically something I avoid.
Unappreciated.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have people who know exactly what they're doing, and so in that case, certainly put it in. But you'll see things. I mean, certainly if you're going for if you want to do an all down kind of thing, like by all means, you have to write it that way. But if you're writing, 30 seconds, and we're like, no, you don't want to do that. So that then becomes too technical. As much as we appreciate the kind of intention is clear, if you see a bunch of down bows like that. We'll translate that and be like, that should have been written in a different way, right?
I would maybe slightly disagree with Sam that there are situations in which we get really, really good bowings from the composer, and sometimes they don't seem intuitive, and then we try them again, and then they actually work. So
from the string players.
it can work, but at the same time, it really depends on your vision. It depends how well you know the instrument. And even if you do know the instrument, I mean, we can talk about bowings all the time and have disagreements and change our mind. And next time, oh, why did I write this? So we can disagree with ourselves as well. So that being said, composer is not always wrong by writing bowings. So it is a bit of a mystery. I personally wouldn't know what to advise to them.
I think one thing in terms of bowings that is, I don't want to say it's problematic, we're going to change it anyway, is when we see long lyrical slurs, they don't mean the same thing to us as they might to a wind player, as they might to a pianist. I think pianos and wind players kind of deal with it in similar ways. String players, we don't. It means bow direction to us, or some sort of just legato, something that's supposed to be smooth. So we're probably going to change it because we don't have everlasting bows, and until we invent those, we're going to change it on you anyway. If you feel like it's necessary to imply phrasing, if your writing is clear, we're probably going to intuit that phrase. I'm sure there are other ways, like maybe if you want to really watch your beaming. If you're beaming things in a certain way, you can imply phrasing as well. So you don't necessarily need to show us exactly how long the phrase is from end to end with a slur, but just by how you're beaming things or organizing things within a bar, even.
So we're basically composers are better off writing like legato or smooth or cantabile rather than sticking an enormous big slur over the
I mean, or just be okay knowing that we're probably going to chunk that up. Like we see where you're going, but we're probably
but it's more the
chunk
intention of there was a big sigh.
Again, something that I would slightly disagree with.
Okay.
Because it doesn't hurt for us to see the long phrase.
Sure.
Because then we'll think, oh, that's so interesting. You want us to play this magnificently long phrase, but we will have to chop it up many times.
Yeah.
So absolutely. So I would rather see the incredibly long and unrealistically long phrase for the everlasting bow than separate notes, and then we show up at the workshop and we play everything separately. And then the composer says, oh my God, can you guys slur a little bit? Can you make it more legato? And then they're like, oh, that's exactly what I wanted. Yeah. So because for a string player brain, when we see the notes that are not slurred, we don't necessarily phrase them in the same way. We don't connect them. We play them 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So we usually detach them slightly just because the direction of the bow is such. So I think writing things like legato are a little bit weird to see.
I guess, like I said, I think it's like just be okay. You're almost gonna have to be okay with us splitting that up because it's not actually possible. So you can write it, but just know that it's probably gonna get split up.
If you write legato and don't put a slur, we would connect the notes as much as possible and change directions as opposed. Like we would definitely play it differently. And yeah, I mean, I kind of follow a little bit on Alex's side, even though I appreciate the point. But like historically, someone like Brahms was writing piano slurs, as in phrasing slurs. And to contradict myself from a bit earlier, one option that you would have, and I don't recommend this for the entire piece, but if this is how you want to express yourself in a certain passage, putting a large slur and putting bow directions underneath can certainly be an option. Like if you put a slur over 4 bars, and then you put an up bow on the second bar, down bow on the third, and an up bow on the fourth, then it's very clear that
Or
it's a
even
huge
just
thing.
other smaller slurs in between.
Yeah,
like
that could work too.
Because
Yeah.
if you're,
By all
I mean,
means.
within large phrase, it's kind of like within a long sentence, you can still put a comma, right? So you
Yeah.
can still sort of define what those smaller, like like crusts and are within the phrase by little slurs on top underneath the big slur. So there's sort of many ways you can do it, but yeah, it's kind of just how we interpret it. I guess as you're getting sort of like creative interpretations of what we would like to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, I think it's just kind of like having a clear vision as to why you're doing something. And I mean, bringing up wind slurs is very interesting because winds are often about where you take the breath. And so if I was doing a short phrase with a pickup like ba da da da, you would actually slur over from the pickup into the next thing. Whereas we probably go separate bow, ba da da da.
Yeah.
So by doing that, it's a very different way of slurring. And I know that when I'm doing orchestral stuff, the slurs and the winds don't match up in any way. It's like even if they're playing the same thing, just like you're doing slurs and the winds and the strings are all chopped up, but it's a different way to go. So yeah, 3 really distinct ways. You know, is it breathing? Is it a bowing? Which we can kind of, wind players can certainly phrase over breaths, but breaths are a bigger termination, if you will.
Yeah.
Whereas we can really go over bow changes in one phrase much more. And arguably in piano, every note is really its own thing, so that's why you really got to see the bigger phrase.
Right.
You know.
But all this to say, a composer shouldn't feel embarrassed or bad about notating something wrong just because they haven't heard it IRL in real life, right? And so that's why it does help to hear, it does help to workshop. And we always encourage people to send us things, and we, nowadays we can always record it, send an MP3, and then we get, oh my God, I didn't mean that, I'm so sorry, just because they haven't heard it, how it would sound with the real players. And so that's why you shouldn't expect to be perfect when you write it and exactly what you had in mind, exactly how it's going to really sound, because you'll be, oh, that's so interesting, I want one instrument maybe separate, the other guy's legato, and so on and so forth. So it's
if you would like a good example, I don't know if you guys have it, but just even something to look up is the second movement of the Barber String Quartet. Has a long slur over the first 4.5 bars. There are many, many, many notes in that slur. It is also marked molto adagio. There is no way, to play that in one bow. But I can guarantee that you're probably going to watch a plethora of videos of quartets playing this with different bowings, but achieving the same common goal of that 4.5 bar phrase.
Right.
And I know it's something that, I performed it, not with you guys, that we had large disputes over how many are we going to go in one direction and why, where does the phrase go, blah, 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 all sorts of things. So.
But I guess that's sort of a classic example of the composer sort of making it very explicit, like, this is the sound I would like.
Right.
Yeah.
Go forth and figure out how to do it.
Exactly.
Right.
And to change notation and to jump back on this, like if we talk about things like spiccato or ricochet, in terms of like too much information versus not enough, and I think that we'll see oftentimes people trying to notate certain things like ricochet, and what I find amusing is that probably the most famous example of ricochet would be the William Tell overture.
Right.
And it says nothing. It says nothing at all. It's just 2 16ths and an eighth, and you just, like, with the tempo, you get into it.
For those who don't know what ricochet is, we bounce the bow
In the same direction.
in the same direction. It can be 2 notes, it can be 3 notes, it can be 4 notes, it Can you find notes? Or you let it go forever. But this one is 2 + 1.
But what's written, Alex? What's written, actually?
I don't remember.
Oh. And there's like nothing else written
There's
there,
nothing.
but like even I tried to approximate his tempo, and it sounded not so good because the technique that I used of just reversing the bow direction just kind of puts me under a lot of body tension to be able to execute the speed. So that's why we revert to other techniques that allow the bow to bounce freely and allow me the speed that I need. So.
This might tie into something we were talking about beforehand, which is the amount of perhaps not recomposition but rewriting that string players will sometimes do with or without telling composers. And so I'm just curious, sort of what are the sort of common examples of that? Is it possible for composers to maybe save you some time by just not doing the things that you often find yourself consistently having to recompose and rewrite? Not to change the composer's intentions, but in fact the opposite, to get to what the composer wants, perhaps in spite of what the composer has written.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a loaded question.
Just don't use any names and it's okay.
No.
I think we rewrite double stops all the time.
Yes.
That's something we do a lot.
Very common.
And it really, I can't give a specific rule. But you know, if you've got, it really, and it depends on the instruments that are involved in this. But like, if you've got like an octave for one instrument and the third in the middle, may be worse than if you give like a fifth and a sixth. Although, you know, fifth on your instruments compared to mine,
yeah.
exactly. So it really depends on where you're sitting.
I think this is where consultation is really like the key. So like, you know, write what you want. We're gonna look at it. If we're graced with the ability to see all the parts at the same time, we'll look at it and just kind of go, so you do this, and this makes more sense for me. Hey, well, can you play this double stop? And then it'll probably be rewritten by whoever you're consulting with. And if you would like to know the why, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer.
But do challenge us. I think that you should challenge the players. If you feel like you're going for this, we just played a sextet by Tchaikovsky the other day, and in the sextet with 6 strings, he writes double stops for everyone. So it's 12 instruments playing suddenly. So we were all thinking, why did you do this? You already have so many players. It sounds awesome. And then he's like, no. I'm going to give you some double stops here, and I'm going to make it even thicker and more epic. So do challenge us, and then we can come and see, you know, what works. Maybe one of the instruments is going to play a single voice just to make sure that it's nicely in tune, and the other guys are maybe going to suffer a little bit. Generally, there are certain things to avoid, but as Sam says, sometimes it's just literally distribution. We did, I do remember we did a workshop quartet in a studio with a composer, and we just had to switch the instruments in certain bars. So for instance, viola took the cello part, and cello took the violin 2 part, and then violin 2 took the cello part, because the composer wrote really high stuff for the cello, and we sat down and we thought, okay, why would you be suffering? Are we going, the high register in cello doesn't really sound that epic, that cannot be replicated on violin almost with the same
not to say that you can't go up there, certainly, by all means, but you need to really mean it. And if we see it and kind of go, well, why, then we can redistribute.
Right, like if you want like a lush, sort of stable sounding chord, then maybe putting the cello up high is not.
And especially
but
if
if
you
you want
jump
something that's maybe
to it
vulnerable and
ethereal,
then maybe
precisely.
So the other example was also Divide and Conquer, where we had a composer write this line that was recurring, repeating, and the cello was going higher and higher and higher. And then we literally asked Sam, okay, what's the highest you're comfortable going? And he said, well, it's going to be this note on the A string. And then
these were jumps, right? So they were going from here and then just progressively jumping higher and higher. And so it's not about going up, it's about jumping accurately without a fret.
So instead of him failing to reach these notes because it's just not practical and it's just extremely hard, we had a situation where basically what we decided to do is that we found what was the comfortable moment for Sam to go, and then Matt took over the following couple of jumps, then Tanya took some of the following jumps, and again it was the same effect. So it's
There is a good example that we have of this, where we do have originally written double stops in the cello. There's a passing line between myself and Matt and Alex even. So perhaps we play you exactly what we have played, and then we show the original.
Sure.
And if you send us afterwards, we can edit in.
Sure.
We can edit in a picture of what, so everyone can see what they're looking at.
But do you guys have the original as well?
Yeah, I can still see it. Because yours is the same. It's also from the weekend. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Right? It's also under his last name.
Dare I ask, is this a newer work? Is this
Yes.
an older work?
It is a newer work.
This work is actually featured on our new album called Between the Lines, and Between the Lines just dropped last Friday, so less than a week ago, and so it's accessible to everyone.
There you go.
So everyone go check out their record.
There you go.
We'll plug it once more before the end.
Sure.
So what we're doing first, right?
Yeah, let's do what we always do, what we have been doing.
And
Our
you wanna
amended
play
version.
just that third line, or?
Yeah, just the third line. So if you, let's do it one more time, and what you want to notice is two things. What I'm doing, and what Matt is doing in conjunction, and also what Sam's doing. Alex, yours is the same. So let's do the same thing one more time, and just notice my line specifically. And then do what's printed. And my line will be very different, and Sam's will also be really different.
Yeah.
So now my line gets passed off to the viola, and Sam has a bigger job to do. Playing double stops.
So that was the notated. That's the original.
That's
the
noted,
OG notated version.
Notated.
So
yeah.
so just to describe it a little bit, and like a few different elements happening here. So in the original, I've got fourths, which is never an excellent double stop, at least on cello, but I think we all kind of don't like fourths. Thirds, fine. Fifths, me okay, them less. Sixths, universally are fine. But fourths, they're a little bit hard to make sound excellent. So Matt had in his part, and so the choice here was to go with sevenths instead.
So if you just look at the shape of Sam's hand, it's more open rather than the
opposed-
fourths are closed.
Yeah,
It just
I
makes
mean,
it feel a little bit more awkward.
So from a technical perspective, the issue is about the finger going over the string that's vibrating versus the other shape where this finger is behind, and so this part of the string doesn't vibrate, so I can't block the string, and so you got the lower finger on the lower string and the higher finger on the other string versus the other one. If I play this,
it's already more awkward how
I can
torque
stop
the
it
wrist.
if
Exactly.
I'm, so it's you got to stand in different ways opposed to playing that if you were playing it in tune, for example. So that's certainly a more comfortable thing to do. So then I took that from Matt, and then Matt took my upper line from the double stop.
Yeah.
You want to play that?
Which is.
And then what happened in the second bar of that is that whatever Tanya was playing, then Matt was covering it on the second bar of that. Matt covered that line both times, right? Am I right on that?
No, other way
I
around.
cover it.
She
Oh,
covered it
okay,
both times.
so you're doing the 16th both times?
Mhm.
And then Matt jumps in and plays the second violin line on the second bar.
No, I play your top cello.
On the second bar?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Both times. Yeah.
So it's just things to make a little bit more simplistic. Even from my perspective, to get out of one pattern of do-da-do-da-do-da-do-da-do-da-do-da-do-da and stop all of a sudden is a little bit nerve-wracking. I'm sure it's even worse for you the other way around if you had a bunch of long notes and then had to go into another pattern. So I'd basically do the same pattern twice.
Okay.
So it makes it a little bit easier.
So if we can just sort of wrap this whole thing up, could I ask you to do like just back to back, like the OG version?
Yeah.
And then just like and then do the fixed
The
version.
amended version? Okay.
Yeah.
Should I be playing, or should you just the three of you play?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Just the
the three of us. Sure.
Okay, so this is the original. 3. And what we've changed is this. 3.
Sounds more confident and cleaner, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was very cool.
Yeah, so I mean,
Thanks for
again,
pointing
it's
that.
just kind of like just reworking what we have in front of us in order to make it, sound better for the configuration. It's not,
Right.
It's not, and this is not a dig at the composer at all.
No, and this brings us to something that I know Joseph was keen to cover, which is sort of the back and forth negotiation of when is it appropriate or inappropriate to ask for changes to be made. So, when is it? I guess this gets into a lot of things because it's so much about like how much time do you have in a rehearsal, how much, whether it's budget for composer or something like that. Like, when is it? Like in that case, did you go to the composer and say, we're going to make this change, or did you just sort
He
of?
wasn't aware of this one. I don't think until the recording session, perhaps, or still maybe just now he found out.
Yep, I think you just found out.
Sorry.
No, it's such an interesting question because we've actually like many times been in a studio, and actually including Sam's piece, which Sam wrote a piece many years ago, and we performed it, and then we started being, oh hey, how about we workshop it a little bit? So we workshopped it, we rehearsed it, and then in the studio Sam said, well, I don't know about this line, and then can you add this? So you see the Matt writing 16 notes in the studio before we were just about to start recording it.
It gets worse. Matt was editing it, and I emailed him, and I was like, do we have a version where we did this instead of that? And he was like, I don't think we recorded that. I'm like, damn it, I think I prefer that version over the other. So like even in the editing portion, I was still changing my mind. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you're not a member of the group, it's certainly a much more dicey question. And there's no real answer to it. But one thing that I'll point out is that one thing that I'm really bad at as a composer, and Alex bugs me about this all the time, is that the changes that we put in should be eventually reflected in a official proper score.
Yeah.
However, if we're playing a piece that's submitted to us and we've been working on it for a week, or whatever, you know, we mark things, we mark bowings, we mark slurs, we trade stuff, whatever. It's not really useful for the composer to give us an updated score the day before the show, because now we have to transfer everything from one to the other, and that's not really that useful. So it's better for us to read our markings. As much as it's really important, and I note to self, really important to actually update your score, we may want to play off the old score. If you do update the score, and especially if you do update it often and send us updates, now it depends on everybody. We're playing on tablets, and we're playing off of full scores. So for us who are playing in this way, this is just personal advice. Don't change the layout of the page at all if you're sending us an update, because what we can do in this context, and this only applies to tablets, when we update it, we can keep our markings, and we just update the file underneath.
Okay.
So if all of a sudden you've made you changed the first bar and it's changed the layout for the rest of the piece, all our markings are in the wrong place, and we can't do that. But if you've locked all of your bars, and yeah, some can probably change a couple of widths and whatever.
Yeah.
But if you've locked them in and it's the same, we just kind of like put it underneath, and all our markings will remain. Sometimes what we've marked is redundant because you've now changed it and put, you know,
So we'll see the change in our part, but it's also going to be changed.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but these are more technical things.
Very
And
technical,
just
yeah.
very technical, and also just avoiding confusion and speeding up the process. But by all means, if we had, as Sam says, if we had workshopped it and worked on it, and then the concert is the next day, you don't need to hustle. But we do applaud and congratulate all the composers who actually follow up with us after the performance or recording session or whatever the situation was, and they ask us, "Hey, can you please send us your markings? I want to put it in the score."
Yeah.
So, and they're more diligent than some other composers. And
I've never done that in my career. So, like,
that's who you were talking about.
it is just so easy to let it go, and then you can get in a horrific situation where 3 years after you want this place to be played, and then you're going back to the players and be like, "Hey guys, do you still have the score saved?"
Right.
And then
Yeah.
maybe Tanya's tablet crashed in the meantime, or we lost the score, or we changed or updated or whatever it is. So one does have to keep up with these things with the freshest, and just like mark it, set it in stone, put it aside, and ready to be played in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And but as a composer, one thing that's this might be slightly changing directions.
That's fine.
But when you're in the room with we're rehearsing, whether it's a concert or rehearsal, if you couldn't attend rehearsals, then it's the concert, or whatever. But if you're rehearsing with us and you find yourself giving a bunch of comments, just be very aware, or just record in your mind what those comments are, because those are things that potentially could be included in the score. So basically, it feels like every comment or any redirection, let's call it a redirection, is basically information we didn't have, right? So if it's an interpretation that we've made and of a certain passage, and the composer didn't want it interpreted that way, then you need to write a slightly narrower, like put more limitations on that interpretation, versus keeping it really wide open.
But to really answer the question on, just to jump in, I have this incredibly thoughtful comment, is that when is it too late to send? It's never too late, but it comes with the risk of it not being performed well. So let's say you come in and you say on the day of the concert and say, "You know what, the dress rehearsal was great yesterday, but like I really want the viola part more expressive, more sparkly, whatever it is." And then and Matt is generous and I'm kind enough to say, "You know what, yes, let's do it." But then maybe in the performance something is going to happen. It's not going to be as brilliant, and it's just not going to work out. And then you're risking the potential. Like it might not be that kind of edition. Maybe it's going to be a change where it's a slow passage. It's something very simple, and we had all sorts of situations where recently at the concert we were supposed to play a third movement of a string quartet, and we rehearsed it. So this is a really cool story. So we were going to play the second movement originally. And we said, okay, it's the second movement. We get an email, and the organization says, "Oh, we want you guys to play the third movement." And we said, "Okay, no problem. Let's do the third movement." We all agreed. No worries. We can do that. We come to the concert, and it's the concert program, and it says the second movement, which we hadn't rehearsed as much as the third movement. So we all looked at each other. We didn't even talk. We looked at each other, and it was this movement. Everybody agreed, and we went and played it. And it was slightly terrifying. But I think we did a fairly good job. But it was a risk that we were going to bomb it.
Did you see it in the program? I mean, I saw it afterwards.
Yes, I did. I did see it in the program.
I found out when the composer was saying,
Yeah, same.
they're going to play the second movement. And we're like, okay.
So speaking of when it's too late, we literally had 30 seconds
Okay.
to change what we were playing.
Right.
And we were confident enough to do it. If this was, the lyric suite by Berg, just sight reading, there's no way we could do it,
Yeah.
So it depends what it is, and again, sometimes changes are easy and we can implement them. So it really depends, but you are risking that the performance is not going to go so well. So that's the risk that you have to take and own and stand behind.
So if it's never, this is a question coming in from someone, if it's never too late, with a big asterisk attached to that, the quality may be impacted. What's ideal? Like, when's an ideal time for, or
I think it
Anytime.
depends. I think it depends on what you're also throwing at us
Yeah.
too. Like if you're throwing us, like in Alex's example, he was talking more about how you're approaching phrasing something. I would say that's far less risky because you're playing the same stuff on the page, just maybe with a different mindset, right?
Right.
But if you're like, oh, I'm taking out these 8 bars that were just, goose egg whole notes before, and we're going to give you all 30 seconds, not as nice. So, like, it depends on how far on that spectrum of, because that's a pretty large range of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And even, if you're changing an accidental or something, maybe less, like 1 or 2, fine. But if you're changing a whole bunch, not as nice, right? So, because that means handshapes for us. So,
Right.
it really depends on how
Sort
big
of
the change
an
is.
inverse relationship there between
Length of time
Yeah.
and what the technical challenges are going to be.
Art is very complicated, especially performing art. So that's why
That's our takeaway from today's art is complicated.
art is complicated. And you know why it's complicated? Because answering ideal questions, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Because even if you have a symphony orchestra, if they have to rehearse a piece, a Bartok's concerto for orchestra versus Brahms' Second Symphony, there's quite a discrepancy in the number of rehearsals you need. As a music director of an orchestra, you sit down or let's go back to string quartet. When we program things, we look at the program and then we talk. What do you guys think? Maybe should we do 6 rehearsals, 7 rehearsals? And we fight about this. We not fight, but we have disagreements, and it's verbally fight. So no violence.
Constructive discourse.
Nice.
Robust discussions.
Robust discussions. And Sam and I have these discussions quite often where I say, I don't know, we need another rehearsal. And then I can be wrong. We schedule a 4-hour rehearsal, and we recently had a rehearsal where we were all late. There was somebody wanted to move the time, and we got things done in 2 hours.
Yeah.
So we had too much time to rehearse. So, but okay, let's give some sort of an ideal scenario. You send us the score 6 months before the concert. The concert date is in 6 months from now, right? So we get the score, we read it, we workshop it a little bit. Oh, looks playable. Or, oh my God, what is this thing? Like, what was he or she thinking? Like, oh, this is really confusing. Or like, can you simplify it for us? And then we start the discussion. We, work on the score a little bit together. You send us revisions. Or it's still unclear. Oh, now it's much clearer. We want to change the meter. Like, there can be really technical things in this situation where we get a score and we are really struggling to read it. And we're like, oh my God, if only he wrote it in 5/8 instead of, 3/8, 2/8, 4/8, 1/8, like these kind of things where we would really like to see different meter. It's going to really speed up the process. And then even within the quartet, we can say, one of us says, no, it's not worth it, man. Like, don't bother them. And then the other person says, no, really, trust me. Tell them to change it if they're comfortable with it, if they have the original score. Just like rewrite the meter. Mm-hmm. And then we read it again. In 10 minutes, we are done. So sometimes it all it takes is clearer score. And then, but speaking of changes, and then let's say we are 2 months before the concert and we start rehearsing it, and we send you, it is paramount for us to, and for the composer to keep the conversation going and send them the MP3 of a mock rehearsal where we are out of tune, not necessarily polished, but they get the picture. And then, and maybe there's going to be a few changes there, but let's say a week before the concert, send us your final revision and live with it, trust in us and trust in yourself that it's going to sound good. But of course, we can get a phone call the night before where you say, I really don't want, that E flat in the cello, I want it tacit, and we will implement it for you. So
it's never too late to pull those out.
Yeah.
Exactly. Less is more.
I was playing a show yesterday, and it was really interesting. We get to a part, this is with the orchestra, and it's in 5 sharps, and there's this one little spot that's an A flat major. They didn't change the key signature, not a problem. See a bunch of flats, no problem. But they weren't rewriting the A flat, or rather they were leaving the notation as G sharp instead of A flat. Okay. So as you're going up, you're seeing you've got your E flat F, and then you've got a G and then a G sharp, and it's just those kinds of things. All of a sudden, it's like we had to rehearse that part a couple of times, but if it was notated properly in the first place, I don't know why I got onto this topic. You talked about something with notation, because you talked about the meter stuff. But anyways, it's one of those things that rehearsal time was not necessary for this passage, but because of the way it was notated.
Right.
I might be seeing something a little bit obvious.
Tangentially,
Yeah.
I'm sure that I can definitely speak for myself, but maybe also for you guys, because you're talking about accidentals. Unlike, I'm gonna say mostly pianists.
It's always pianists.
Well, I mean, I also used to play too, so I know the mindset. I don't necessarily think of G sharp and A flat as anything different when I'm gonna go touch the key.
Okay.
But if I see that on my page as a string player, the first thing that is my default is a particular finger. So that means that it sets me in a particular hand shape. So if you go mixing sharps and flats in the same like little snippet, it breaks my brain because what it does is it changes my perception of how far away those notes are. Even if I know all the theoretical stuff behind it, that causes me just an extra millisecond of doubt or of just like measurement, and I might measure wrong because of I'm in this hand shape but it says this accidental, right? So trying to keep your apples with your apples and your oranges with your oranges, and your flats with your flats and your sharps with your sharps. I mean, there are extraneous sort of like situations where that might not be able to be the case, but generally speaking,
I feel like that's underrated in a world where a lot of composers get into you build your pitch collection on the piano, and like you said, like I'm a pianist as well.
Yeah.
A flat, G sharp,
whatever,
same
right.
garbage.
Yeah.
But and I feel like we get sort of build these rows, we get quite stuck on the beautiful way it looks at the flats and the
Right.
sharps, and that sometimes we just sort of dump that into Sibelius and put that into the to the instrumental parts, and it's really doing a bit of a disservice.
And
I
like
think that's-
even like from the perspective, and we've definitely got this many times across the board from different composers, different ages, all sorts of stuff, where they're very adamant of this is an A flat major chord, so no, I'm not going to give you a D sharp. I'm going to give you an E flat.
Right.
But it doesn't matter what you had before. That's the spelling of the chord, and it's like, but I'm seeing sharps and double sharps all of a sudden, and it breaks your brain. So it's like sometimes you might have to like just release that necessity of spelling things the exact right way, vertically speaking, and look at the horizontal too, and how we're approaching it from only our part from a left to right perspective, because it can really change how we approach things.
Yeah.
Not to mention, these are one of those things that I might actually just go in and take my big white, pen and just rewrite it the way that I want to see it. I've done that many times.
Yeah. But I mean, anything that causes a brain break
Right.
is going to cause a rehearsal break or a rehearsal hiccup.
That's
Or
fair.
just, or even in a concert situation, it's just that thing that is coming up, and you're spending energy on it, right? Whether or not you've practiced it 1,000 trillion times, you remember that's that spot with that weird thing that I'm thinking about right now.
But
So.
even between ourselves, there is even the four of us. We play together a lot, and we see things quite similar way and more similarly. But I can keep choking on a passage, and Tanya can keep telling me it's so easy. Just like she can coach me because she understands it and I don't. So it's kind of my fault. It's not. But if all four of us choke,
Maybe something in the right.
Yeah. If four people tell you you're drunk, you should probably sit down, right?
But I mean, I think Alex and I were talking about this. Sometimes things are misspelled, or whatever, for whatever reason. And for us, who are playing like a non-fretted, non-keyed instrument, expectation of, and this is true with all musicians. I'm not trying to say that wind players or pianists are not expecting a pitch before it happens. I think we all do that. But for us, it's very important because you kind of like that. There's no measurement. Well, there's measurement, but that's a very important thing for us. And so, if you're writing a C major chord as C, F flat, G, and C, that expectation that I've got that's a C major chord is going to be completely messed up. And so, Alex and I were just discussing, like, we just put chord symbols underneath, like we just write that, C major, and you just play C major. And so it's a shortcut for us because every time when you intake the information on the page as 4 individual notes, that's 4 times the processing as if I intake it as one chord, right? So if I see, a C major chord as a C, E, G, C, I just see that. It's like seeing a scale. You don't think about all the individual notes inside the scale in the same way that when we talk, we make sentences and we don't think of the letters that are making up the words and whatever, right? So, it's just, those shortcuts for us, or rather the hindrance it's just more processing, and more processing means less attention focused on the bigger picture or the musicality or whatever.
There's one quick thing I want to cover, and then one more extended topic that I want to cover. So the quick one sort of relates to some of the things we've been talking about when to make changes, when to make comments, so like, for lack of a better term, like etiquette. So composer walks into rehearsal, doesn't know you guys very well, doesn't have like a personal relationship, maybe is not from a performing background, because I think increasingly you have composers who aren't from like, don't have, I've never played in a string quartet, I've only played in like jazz and rock bands. Like, what are the sort of basic etiquette rules that a composer should follow? When is it appropriate to like cut you off if you're in the middle of working on something? When is it appropriate to jump in with a comment? What sort of comments are not even appropriate, not even like what sort of comments are helpful versus unhelpful? Like, how should a composer behave?
What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think it's it's like anything else. You kind of got to read the room.
It's very hard for many composers to do.
So I mean, I feel like if we're spending a lot of time going in potentially the wrong direction, then I think it is absolutely appropriate for you to stop us, because then we're just wasting time. If we're spending time if we basically understand the direction that the composer wants us to go with, and then I think maybe you can add a few things. But ultimately, I think there's if it's clear that we already understand what's happening, then you can kind of just let us do our thing. I don't know.
Yeah, reasons to stop. I mean, certainly, momentum is an important thing, especially if we're trying to get a bigger picture and present it to you as the composer. But like, so if it's just a simple thing of like this C is actually sharp, like you just circle that and you tell us at the end, obviously, But
right.
No need to stop the momentum of a run or whatever. But by all means, as Matt says, certainly reading the room, just like any conversation, is the way to go. We tend to be pretty relaxed people, so if the person comes in and is really chill like you are, and we kind of like, we don't know each other that well, but clearly we can have kind of a joking relationship, and we can work that way. That's great. But there's people that come in and we can tell that it's like they're very, very specific, very particular, and you want to work in that way. And I'm just going to give a quick story. A colleague of mine just told me a story about Schoenberg, how he was a very negative person, so in general,
Shocking.
Yeah. And so he came in to a sextet reading Verklichte Nacht, and typically when people would play things, he'd kind of stop every X amount of bars and give a negative comment of it's not at all what I wanted. Again, if that's not what you want, make sure you write in the score. But anyways, but one of the cellists was friendly enough with him, and he told him, is it okay if we just play through the whole thing, and then we'll talk. And so he obliged, and so they played the whole thing, and then he said, that was awesome. So at some point, if you stop in bar 3, and then we try again, we stop in bar 5, and then we stop in bar 10 because we only started bar 5, and whatever, like at some point, it's kind of like you're trying to replicate the MIDI that you've got or something, and you're trying to control it too much. And not to say that it's not warranted or valid, absolutely, but like sometimes you kind of got to look at the bigger picture and give the comments that will make the most effective thing. In terms, just one thing, as far as teaching is concerned, and Tanya is probably the best teacher here, but as in the only teacher here. But like one of those things that I've heard or followed before is that you listen to the person play, you've got 10 comments, and you only say the top 3 or top 2, and that will shake down, and the rest will be taken care of. So it's a little bit similar to that.
No, but the rehearsal flow is something very, complicated, and we get stuck all the time. So we have 4 movements to rehearse, and we are stuck on the second movement we have a 3-hour rehearsal, and 2 hours in, we are still on that movement, and then one of us says like, okay guys, it's usually me. So because I'm a very rational person, I think, And I just realized that we spent 2 hours and we are halfway through the movement. We haven't even finished the movement, and I say, guys, we need to go to the other movements now. We have to drop it. And I get a lot of resistance because people are so passionate about finishing this and doing the right work. And in a perfect world, yeah, we want to finish it. But so the flow of the rehearsal is a tricky thing. As Matt says, I really like what you said about reading the room. We also read the room, because we get the composer who can be a little bit defensive and say, no, that's actually what I really wanted. And we recorded a whole album of music, and there was a lot of notes that didn't make sense to us, where just we didn't feel that A flat is makes sense in that particular chord, but almost in 100% of the cases, composers said, no, that's exactly what I wanted. And we realized that's going to be the flow of that particular session, of that particular project, where we are actually going to pretty much stop questioning these decisions, and we'll have to learn this different language. And when we listen to the recording, in the end, we learn to, I don't want to say learn to like it or love it, or we just understood what was behind it. So in a way, let us help you, because we are technically, the moment you give us the piece, we become the co-writers. I think that the difference between pop music is, when you see some of the biggest hits of pop music, you see like 10 names writing this song. And recently I realized that the band Roots, which is a hip-hop R&B band, had this white guy write a lot of music for them.
Scott Storch.
Scott Storch, exactly. And I had no idea, so I did this research for whatever reason. And I saw this guy writing all these unbelievable killer beats. He wrote the Steel Dre and stuff. So I was like, dude, this white dude with all these like incredibly talented black guys, it's so interesting. But because in pop music you have, in classical music world, I think oftentimes we are the ghostwriters as players, because in a certain way, and you should take advantage of that, because it can only benefit you. Because if you hate what we say, we're not going to do it. If you like what we say, implement it, and you get all the credit. So you basically win. You win. While we were in a pop music world, we would say, "Where are my royalties, man?" So give me those royalties. So we'll be generous enough, and I guess a lot of string quartets or a lot of performers, whether it's a pianist or whoever, they'll actually help you, whether it's a technical thing or a musical thing or a wrong note thing, where we say, did you really want an A flat there? And you say, oh no, actually, I understand now, it's actually a D minor chord, so A flat would be a little bit too much of a crunch, unless you really went for it, or it's a wrong setting or wrong voicing, or I'm losing my train of thought right now, but all this to say is that the flow is very important of the rehearsal, and maybe it is a good idea to play through the piece and then go back and see how we can improve it. And if it means, it can be a bit of a tougher session where we are stopping every 2 bars and fixing things, and it's tiring for everyone, but then the next rehearsal will be all, oh wow, all that work that we invested is now paying off. So, and we will sometimes show up at the rehearsal and reading with the composer, they say, yep, it's amazing, let's record it. And we record it and everybody goes home. So it's just so hard to say how long something is going to take time, and we can have plenty of time to really, we will show up at the recording session and maximize every second, and we will leave the studio in absolute distress because we are not sure that we got everything. So this has happened. Our first album, every single session, I'm really disappointed because I'm not sure whether we got everything, and that's all the time we had. And we'll show up at a session where we have 3 hours, and within first half an hour we basically finish the job, and then we can take our time and punch in and do another take, and let's do another take. Why not? We have all this time, right? So it's so we don't know how long things take necessarily, because does it depend on what state of mind preparation and overall feel is or not. So
just a quickie about keeping that environment for the composer, and you both kind of said things that kind of fall into this wave of you said wrong note, and you said pointing out a C sharp or whatever it is. If there is a note that you've noticed that we've played incorrectly, maybe give us the human error first.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, MIDI is MIDI, and we are not that. We are very much living, breathing people who have errors. So if it's a reading error, you've heard us do it 2-3 times, definitely let us know. If we've done it once, give us the human error. Like, just give us the benefit of the doubt, right? So until we've done it multiple times, and you can say, yeah, no, I think that maybe that's just a
Unless you realize that you wrote it wrong and then give
True
us
that.
back.
Yeah.
Then you can give us credit.
If it's on you, own it quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The great thing from using scores is that we actually find mistakes in each other's parts
Right.
all
Right.
the time.
Yes.
And then we also find a moment where we're like, hey, Matt, that's an E natural. Oh my God.
It keeps us honest.
Yeah, it keeps us, and we help each other that way.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
no hard feelings.
Yeah,
yeah.
You don't shoot each other with water pistols when each one makes a mistake.
That's
Yeah,
a good
it's
idea.
like-
So
it's
next
like,
rehearsal.
Can you move your viola? I need to wet you.
We're getting
Um,
ideas.
There's a last topic which probably I should have got us to earlier because I feel like it gets into this is a big one. Basically difficulty. So impossible shit, pardon my language, versus hard shit, versus what will take lots of rehearsal time. You were saying beforehand, impossibles on the composer and difficult is on the musician.
Correct. Yeah.
Let's say that a composer doesn't have all the rehearsal time in the world, which we never do. What is the best way for composers to approach writing intricate, difficult, bordering on impossible material? And then how do you approach that?
I think the first thing, and as if you've got people like us in your life, and you can throw something, and we can give feedback. That's obviously the best. But or assuming that even if that's not an option for you, to a certain extent, I think writing what you want first is the way to go. And there will be hurdles. But I was talking to a harpist, and I was saying I'm terrified of writing for harp because it's just completely different kind of, or guitar is another one that writing for classical guitar is really difficult for me. And the harpist said, well, just pretend it's not a harp and tell me what you want, and then we'll discuss what's possible, what's not
Then they
possible.
complain that you've just written piano music for harp.
Right. Well, but that was what they requested.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Is that don't think about the technique too much, and then let's get rid of those notes that I can't play because I've got pedals, right? As in I can't switch between every chord you give me. Like, let's find the common stuff and whatever. That's how you learn how to do this stuff. So I think just kind of like knowing what is possible, but that's it's easy to think that everybody should know everything about every instrument. I mean, you're teaching ed classes at U of T, and the students are supposed to go into schools and basically know how to play every single instrument. And it's like, well, you can't be a pro in every instrument, so it's kind of you getting proficiency up. Same with composers, right? So,
But what is really interesting about it to me is that also, for instance, I'll take Sam as an example. Sam is the type of guy who, in a perfect world, would write for bigger ensembles. That's just his tendency. That's just his brain. That's just something that comes naturally for him. So many of the times I try to ask Sam to simplify, and he can attest to this, simplify bigger pieces to a quartet because it's a cool piece. And I'll say like, hey, why don't you write this for a quartet? And he has very clearly said no every single time. So if let's say I ask him to write a piece of music for a string quartet, it's very likely that he'll make it too difficult. But because of his tendencies to write symphonic music or chamber orchestra music or orchestral music in general, if somebody is a pianist such as yourself, of course that something that comes naturally for you is writing for piano because that's what you know, that's what you understand very well. So getting out of that world can be very challenging because then you're thinking, oh, don't write all these notes. It's too much, too many notes. But maybe it's not too many notes for us. So there is definitely a very difficult decision to be made, how complicated it is. All I can think about is write it clean. So write it difficult, but write it clean is better than write it simple and take away all the glamour, possible sparkles that can be in this music. So
when you say write it clean, can you?
When I say write it
Expand on that a
clean,
little
write
bit?
it well. The same thing, like don't put flats and sharps in the same bar. So certain go with certain guidances on
Right.
how to make our lives easier. So
Beam
Or
clearly.
beaming.
Beaming.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Beaming. We all have this response about beaming.
I see. I've
yeah.
touched on something.
yeah,
Yeah.
don't write like a singer. We've got all of the individual.
Oh yes,
right.
please don't.
Oh.
Yeah, that actually makes it very difficult.
Right,
Yeah.
beam to the bar, beam to the beat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also say, and I guess this is touching on an experience that I'm currently, I guess you can say I work through most of it, is it might seem impossible at first. So if the impossibility is based on our initial reaction, it might not be fair.
True.
Because you're basically saying, this is my language. And I'm like, I don't understand you. And it's like, well, you also don't have like the dictionary of my language, and you've never tried to like go through the textbook to learn my language, so to speak, right? So in learning this impossibility, it might actually become possible. So yeah, sometimes basing it off of like a first, second, third read even is too soon. So yeah, it's like, and so in that whole vein, the earlier we get it, the more times we have to sit with said impossible thing to see if we can make some sense of it. There's obviously, very extreme instances in which that might, not apply. Like, no, you can't ask me to play 6 notes at the same time. That's literally impossible. But I think we know our own limits as ourselves, as players, as our own group.
Also makes me think that maybe there should be 2 versions of your score, where you write more simplified version, and then one where you go thing crazy. And speaking of
Bat poop crazy.
But I think in that scenario, not a terrible idea, but have the simplified one in your back pocket. Don't give it to the musician.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right. Have an ideal solution, and then
Yeah.
a solution that you can live with.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if we say why did you do this, August? And then you say, well, okay, I see what's happening here. But by the way, I have this other score for you guys, just to make everyone's life easier. But maybe things go really well, so then you just fold the easy version and put it aside. So that's the thing where I think it would be definitely very challenging for somebody like Sam to give the simplified version, because he has a vision, and it does sound and I understand why he does it.
But not to sound inflexible. Certainly, I think there's solutions. It's just the solution isn't always to simplify. A solution is to find a solution. Playing 6 notes at once isn't possible, but certainly spreading it out and making it, there's solutions. It's not always a question of like 3 parts remain and yours gets simplified. There's sometimes creative solutions that are possible.
Yeah.
I think as far as gauging, I think that we as performers have to be very careful about complaining about difficulty. And what I mean about that is there's a lot of composers, and I think that we can play an example, from Ravel, for example, where we're not going to email Ravel and be like, dude, like, not possible.
Maybe
Let me know if you figure that
He's
out.
on AOL.
Maybe Telegram.
Yeah, that's right. Is that the new Signal? I think now.
Telegram is the new one you use for really nefarious stuff.
Just I think let's play B, second movement, just to show what is kind of at the limits of possibility in terms of switching between Pitts and Arco, for example.
Okay.
B?
Yeah, let's do B.
Oh, right.
You go until when?
Just the line.
Yeah.
Just line?
Yeah. So let's just let the violins have fun by themselves.
Same thing.
Just to look at that. Yeah.
And that
I can
is
hear
not as good for
hear
me.
composition teachers being like, you can't do that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And actually,
it's tricky.
let's go in the first one. Where's that spot where you guys just trade off?
At the beginning, first
yeah.
page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last line, first page.
Even from the second system.
Oh, second
part.
system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Second system piano, pianissimo?
Yeah, just us really. Yeah. Or do you want the whole thing?
Well, let's put it
Okay.
together. Just look at them trading for no reason, and we'll talk about it. So you think that would pass the composition teacher?
Probably.
Probably not. I mean,
No?
do you want to just play the two of you again?
It's
Just
more of like
do the second system, second bar. That one's
Sure. Yeah.
the most obvious.
I guess the kind of thing that would pass with a composition teacher or composer who's less string. If you're super string guy, you'd be like, oh, that's super awkward. But if you're not, if you're less familiar with string, you'd be a little, because the bowing pits thing is much more obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas the awkward bowing thing, that will slip past more,
So-
more composers than you'd probably expect.
So
was-
like the trade-off that we have to make, or that we try to minimize, is that the distance, because we have to hop over a string or two, depending on how you want to do it, needs me to create space, because there's no way they can be completely seamless. So I guess the trade-off is, or your decision is, am I cool with that space? Or do we struggle to try and eliminate the space? Which is what we're doing now. We're struggling to try and eliminate that space, but it's very difficult to do well. So like, you know, we do our best to put in the reps to see if we can minimize that, and then just kind of do this on the day of whenever we need to play it for anything, right?
Right.
It's kind of an interesting thing, because with the dead composers, obviously, it's definitely doable. And as Tanya says, it's kind of 99% of the time it does work out, but sometimes it doesn't. But I'm almost thinking that, what if he was thinking left and right stereo thing? Of
No.
course, he didn't really have, you know, a great stereo system, Ravel. But what if he was actually in a certain way? Because I'm thinking it as some sort of a, you know, a conversation between the two of us, and he could have easily written it where one person plays one line, the other person just plays the other line, keep it simple. But what if he was actually a step ahead, being like, it's so awesome to trade. He does these crazy lines where he gives cello really high melody things, which he could have, but maybe he's going for this kind of, well, I'm hearing it here, now I'm hearing it there, and I mean, the second violin can definitely sit where the
On the
cello
other
is.
side,
Right.
yeah.
So that conversation would be
Straight on.
very, very cool, and you do engage a listener to do the, you know, where in nowadays world we would be thinking, you know, what's in the left, what's in the right can. So
Well, there's definitely also just the acknowledgement that instruments and players necessarily sound different, and if we know that it's, for him, it's all about color. So it's about that. But I think there's also an element, a separate element that I'm going to talk about from this, which is sometimes that's just more interesting for players. Like if you write something really simple, to make us switch parts and whatever, to really be integrally involved with one another can be engaging. Where if I've got, you know, for 4 minutes, I'm just gonna check out of my role in the thing. But if it, you know, like whatever, it passes around and we can do different things.
Yeah.
We've certainly dealt with that.
there's 2 points to that. What Sam is saying, giving somebody the same line can be very tiring.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So we actually had an example where the second violin had literally
For pages.
for
pages.
five
Pages.
5 minutes, and I remember but there was another piece where you said, oh, I'm going to be fine with it, and I said, no, you're not. She didn't believe me, and when she tried it, it was a stretch. I think it was a stretch. So Tanya had to hold the same harmonic for 5 minutes. She said, "Oh, I'm going to be totally okay."
That's
And
when
I'm so proud of myself. I anticipated she's going to die because it's just going to be so long and the same stretch.
Yeah.
So 2 points. So 1 point is if you give one person the same thing, it's going to be potentially difficult technically to keep doing, or just what's the word? Physically. Thank you.
Yeah.
And 2, it's too monotonous. So by passing the line around, and if it's something if you're not going for the low C string on a cello that none of us can replicate, if you're going for a little bit higher register, maybe maybe the viola can take over, and then you can give something a little more. But challenge each player. That can be a bit of an advice to the composers. Challenge each player in the group to do something. It doesn't have to be the hardest passage, but it can be something, you know, melodic or rhythmical or whatever it is. So give us things to do.
And I think there's an element of like, we had this with one of our lockdown lullabies where this piece was so fast, and we're just like, that's not possible. No, there's just no way, guys. You know, talking about that impossibility factor. It was like, just I can't. There's no way. And then you get hit with the recording, and then you go, shoot.
Yeah.
Because then there is, and it might not be the most accurate, but then it's like, well, if they can sort of do it, then I should probably at least try to approximate that. I could probably even do better, right? So like there's something about like Ravel, for example. You go, you know, he wrote this thing, and we go, that's just bonkers. Like that's just, why would you write that? And then you hear like the Eben Quartet do it, and then you hear the Borodin Quartet do it, and then you hear so many people do it, and you go like, okay, Ravel. And somehow that's validated, right?
Yeah.
So
some of the historic technique, Beethoven in particular, and I personally don't understand the desire of certain professional groups, whether it's orchestras, quartets, pianists, to actually do the original tempi. We have some people in town who actually quite masterfully do it. I don't see the point, except for to honor the composer's original intent to play in this speed. I think that it just loses. It's just not human. Because we have certain limitations of how fast we can play.
but I think it's also, orally speaking, as a listener, can also be really jarring, or just like it's like speaking English without like there's no enunciation. You don't get it, right? Like there's too much information that's coming through for you to make any sense of it. So I think that's all wrapped up in that.
Okay. I mean, my this is, you know, unsolicited advice as a composer, but you know,
I was about to ask for a bit of composer advice, but you go first, and then we're gonna wrap it up.
Certainly, for me, what I like to do, because I'm very much geared towards having composers in front of me, performers in front of me, and this is different than if you're writing a film score, and you're locked to picture, so your tempo is quarter note equals 92.56899. Like that's just what it is, and that's how it works. And the performer doesn't. You can round it down to 92 when you put it on the page, but like that's what it is, and it has to be that, and that's just the way it is. But when it comes to you know, us interpreting what is written on the page, as Alex says, you know, like there's historical tempos and that are around what's written there. I always try to, as a composer, try to give liberty to the performers because I sympathize with people like us.
Performers are people too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not always going to be the tempo and the MIDI and blah blah blah. So what I do, and certainly this is not advice. It's just simply saying what I do. I always not putting a metronome marking can be a little bit mean these days, because you know, you put something and you write brisk, and we go, okay. You know, like, we can do that, but you know, we can find that tempo, but like, you might as well tell us what you're thinking, right?
Yeah.
You know, everybody kind of knows what their DA or their Sibelius finale or whatever is doing. I like to put quarter note equals, and then I put like a range. I put like 90 to 95, and I usually put a C in front of that, so that to give like nice amount of flexibility around it. So like, here's a range approximately, and it at least having something helps us.
Right.
Also helps us because sometimes we don't know the piece, and we're like, okay, well, it's 60 to the quarter note, so it you know, that's 4 seconds per bar. How many bars are there? That's how long it's going to be for programming or whatever, right? Like,
the hard truth is that the harder, the tougher music you write, the less chances you have of it being performed, and that is the terrible and reality. That the more simple you write, the more likely is that maybe you're going to have more amateur or semi-professional or professional or more of the professional groups playing your piece, just because it's going to be easier to learn. And I'm not saying that we want to always have it easy, but if you write an amazing piece of music that's also easy to play, everybody wins. So,
I
but
guess it's also in the context of who it is that you're giving it to.
Yeah.
So like if you're giving it to the, I don't know, Berlin Phil versus like, I don't know, the Oakville Symphony Youth Orchestra. You know, how much time, how difficult, you know, those things can really factor into their ability to want to program it.
how much you want your music to be played? So you just have to ask yourself that question, because if you write a very difficult piece of music and the quartet plays it, premieres it, records it, and it sounds phenomenal, and then other groups try it and they say, oh, this is tough, let's do something else. Are you maybe risking of your piece being performed again live or not? You are. And you just have to find this, what is really you're going for, and how much you want to be.
If I wasn't a member of the string quartet, I don't think I would have written Epitaph, which is a piece I wrote for string quartet and orchestra. And yeah, I don't think that anybody like trying to shop that out. I'm not sure people will go for it. It's pretty complicated. And I remember my favorite part was I remember I'd written most of it. We read it, and Alex, you know, we knew when the performance was, and Alex was like, "Yeah, this is doable as long as what you write is not super difficult at the end." And the coda is like the hardest part. And that was not on purpose at all. I was certainly trying to go for flashy, impressive, but not very difficult, and it was just very difficult. But yeah, or the 10-tone piece, which we have.
So on that note, because I don't have any lingering questions from the folks in the chat here. I'd wrap it up by sort of, there's an interviewer I used to listen to a lot who'd always end his interviews basically asking like, what's the question that you wish I had asked? And so I would sort of morph that a bit to say, what is the thing that if you could walk away from here with like telling a composer one thing to like make things go better, make their rehearsals go better, make their sessions go better, what's that one thing? And let's try. You could either go one each, or if you think you can mind meld one together, but
Sessions are like the way they're writing, like their sessions, like i.e. when they're in the space with us, or
yeah, let's keep it to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say just be open, be open-minded, be open to experimentations, because you have nothing to lose. Be open to writing compose, write whatever you write, and then give the quartet an option to play, or whatever the performer is, or ensemble or soloist is, and then ask them, how would you play this passage if you were to just try it out, and listen to it, and all you have to lose is that it was a terrible idea, a terrible suggestion. It might just be an amazing thing, because like I think I would just suggest use us to be ourselves and to be natural and to just suggest something, and it might just be the best thing, or it might just be a completely disastrous idea, because then all you have to do is disregard it. So it's that simple.
And I think to add to that, because every group is a little bit different in terms of many things. I think one thing, or a bunch of things that we do maybe differently from some other groups, is that we're not afraid of like change. Now that sounds really broad and really like blanket statement-y, but I mean just like it's like, oh, I should have written that in the other key, and then we might actually try to transpose it for you, like, or there are many things that you can like that you should feel free to ask your group. But like a group like ours being so open, we might actually be crazy enough to try it. So yeah, like Alex says, like don't limit your questions because you think that whether it's quartets don't do that or classical musicians don't do that, you might be surprised at what you find on the other side of that.
There's no dumb questions. There's only the dumb things that happen when you don't ask the question.
Don't be afraid to ask the question.
Totally.
Don't be afraid to say, I wrote it this way, but I'm not sure if it's the right way. How about we do this? How we try that?
Yeah.
And but to Tanya's point, when it comes to, for instance, the key, there are certain keys that work better for strings and some that don't. So always something that if you see that something is failing, you feel free to ask the question, do you guys think this should be in D minor instead of, because we live in a digital world now and these things are easy to change. If you have a handwritten score in C sharp minor, you have to handwrite everything in D minor now. You might not be as excited to do that, but if you can literally, we'll have composers send us something, we play it for them, and then we say, it's really hard. It's D flat minor. It's so many flats,
Select all transpose.
Right.
and we'll have
But
them
we
say
get
like,
That's how you do it. Okay.
But we get resonance out of it too. Like the reason that
Yeah.
certain keys work well is because of the natural resonance of the instrument. So if you put something in too many flats or too many sharps, and you eliminate the possibility of an open string ringing, whether that's because you're using it or sympathetically because you're playing one of those notes, then there's something about it that just doesn't vibrate, that doesn't ring, that doesn't resonate.
Which is
in some way.
which can be used as well if you don't want that. I mean,
Right.
Barbara Adagio was written
Either
with
way.
18 flats
Oh,
on
yeah.
purpose so that there is none of
It's
that.
darkness.
Exactly.
It's a total.
So it's not all about
yeah.
ringing, but just being
Sure.
aware of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, composers have been, since people have been writing down things, there's always been kind of issues of interpretation. Like if someone writes a dot, someone writes a line, how short is, does the dot mean short? Does the line mean long? Maybe how long, how short? So if something is kind of unclear, like just know that you're in very good company. And people argue about how to interpret Bach and Haydn and
Oh yeah.
all these people, and there's that's why there's bajillion recordings of the Bach cello suites, because if it was written kind of the way a modern composer might write it, there might be much less room for interpretation, and maybe the pieces wouldn't be as wouldn't be played as often for that reason. I'm not sure. So I think that kind of like the journey of working through things and figuring it out is kind of all part of the fun.
Yeah, I think that if you're a composer and you're writing, if you're writing electronic music, or if you're writing, stuff that you're, film score that you're using samples for or whatever, that's great. But if you're intending on writing for us, as in for performers, whether you're an orchestra, quartet, a solo musician, whatever.
Humans.
Yeah, I think here's my analogy. Think that you're riding a horse, not driving a car. So the car, you tell it to go, and you'll go crash into that wall. And the horse will go, nah, I'm not going to do that. No, you have to steer the horse, as opposed to just it doing what you want. So I think,
we are against
we're the
animal
horses.
cruelty, though.
I was going to say, from now on, next time I work with performers, I'm going to just refer to them as a horse, as a bunch of horses.
Yeah, it's like a stable. Like,
Yeah,
it's 4 horses.
You're going to get a lot of emails from the animal rights.
Yeah, that's right.
Or the
No,
or the automotive.
this opinion is by Sam Bisson only. I don't find myself liable
I
in
said
this.
the horse will not go into the wall.
Yeah. Well, that was really great. I think that was there's a lot that composers at all levels could take away from that, and I think it was really great to just sort of let you guys kind of speak a number of things that I'm sure have bounced around within your own rehearsals and have been said in private. And I think it's one thing that often gets overlooked in composer school is the actual, instead of just learning how to compose, learning how to work with musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this would be a really super valuable resource for people to access, and I'm just really thankful that you guys are able to give us your time for a bit and answer these, kind of get into these kind of complicated questions. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who came online, and plug your albums one last time before we end.
I would like to suggest that we maybe play a really short piece at the end, a 3-minute, since we already have our instruments. So, and I can also just mention, this is let's play the Walker second movement. So this is the movement that we mentioned. Was asked last minute and we performed it. So this is one of the movements that's featured on our last album. We have a few albums out there, one being by Ted Runcie called Jamaican Quartets. We have Canadian Expedition, which is a compilation of many pieces featuring Samuel's Epitaph for string quartet and symphony orchestra. Very, very epic piece. Our first album is called Journey Through Night. It came out in 2021. And our latest album, which came, as I said, just about a week ago or less, It's called Between the Lines, recorded under the Akashic Classics. And this is the second movement from Brandon Walker's Spring Suite, and the movement is called Bloom.
Follow us on social media at Odin Quartet.
And, where's the best place for them to buy their records or buy your records so that they're giving you guys the most amount of money rather than distributors or whoever?
We currently don't have it for sale online, but you can stream it on any platform you like.
Spotify, Amazon Prime,
Okay.
all that.
It's everywhere, but one day we'll be selling it as well and making a lot of money.
You don't need the last 2 bars.
Yes.
Okay.
Nice.
Thanks again for having us.
Thank you.
Pleasure
Everyone,
to be here.
pleasure to have you, and everyone go check out their records.
Thanks,
Okay.
guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks.